The year is 1935. Amelia Earhart becomes the first person to fly solo from Hawaii to California. FDR signs the Social Security Act into law. Warner Brothers debuts their iconic stuttering mascot, Porky Pig. And in Stalinist Russia, the USSR premieres the first international Moscow Film Festival. The festival screens an international selection of films from around the world, and to everyone's astonishment, the Soviet Union took home the grand prize. Among the films screened, one would have a lasting impact on Soviet film history and inspire the reorganization and standardization of Soviet animation. Walt Disney's Silly Symphony, The Three Little Pigs. This showcase, made at the beginning of what would become Disney's golden age, was praised by the Soviet cinematic genius, Sergei Eisenstein, and more importantly, by Uncle Joe Stalin himself. After this, the next 2 decades of Soviet animation in communist Russia would be structurally and stylistically modeled after the great capitalist enterprises of Uncle Walt. This is the story of how Soviet animation would transform and flourish, how the state of animation in the USSR would move from this to this, and how that paved the way for this. Even in 1935, during the screening of the first International Moscow Film Festival, the Soviet Union, as well as its animation industry, was still very young and comparatively underdeveloped. Although there is a history of sophisticated stop-motion animation even before the October Revolution of 1917, Soviet hand-drawn animation lagged behind the technical and artistic innovations that American animation studios had been developing in the 1920s and 30s. The primary animator in pre-Soviet Russia was Vladislav Starovich, a pioneer and master of stop-motion that gained notoriety with his 1912 masterwork, Cameraman's Revenge. Starovich, who had interest in entomology and photography, crafted melodramas using preserved insect models as actors. His films were novel, and primarily for entertainment purposes. He fled the Soviet Union shortly after the revolution, where he would spend the rest of his life perfecting his craft in France, where he would make his magnum opus, The Tale of the Fox, in 1941. The loss of a film pioneer like Starovich no doubt helped to stifle the Soviet animation industry for the first decade of the new nation's existence. Although Starovich's Bugs served as novel entertainment to Russian audiences, animation would take on a different function within the Soviet film industry. The 1920s saw a variety of experimentation with avant-garde and constructivism in the new Soviet art world, as well as within the animation industry. Films like 1924's Interplanetary Revolution, a satire and agitprop of Soviet science fiction, the film was made using a series of paper cutouts and animated like a stop-motion production, not unlike what 2 Americans would infamously develop in the 1990s. Like Interplanetary Revolution, the bulk of notable Soviet animation from this period consisted of satire, agitprop, and, ironically, advertisement. Agitprop, or agitation propaganda, served to illustrate and promote the party line, even to those who couldn't read or write. Regardless of plot and style, many of the animations in this category follow a few key themes. The scheming capitalist pig, the wicked priest, and the dignified working man. Equal parts comedy and propaganda, these animations uplift the goal of the Communist Party and always show the diligent working-class heroes overturning the bourgeois societies of capital and religion. Stylistically very similar to Interplanetary Revolution, China in Flames, produced in 1925, is one of the most notable animations to come out of the mid-20s. With a 50-minute runtime, it is not only the first Soviet feature-length animated film, but one of the first feature-length animated films in existence. And like its predecessor, is also a classic agitprop piece, consisting of animated paper cutouts. These agitprop pieces, unlike most animations being produced globally at this time, were primarily aimed at adult audiences, as can be seen in this only surviving clip from the tragically lost film The Tale of the Priest and his workman Balda. Produced throughout the early 1930s, you can see just how radical the change and standardization of Soviet animation is when you compare it to the much more westernized and child-friendly version of post-Disney 1940. By 1927, a shift began to occur within the Soviet animation industry, and a variety of animated films were being created and targeted towards children, as opposed to the adult-oriented agitprop in the first half of the decade. The first of these animated movies for children is Senka, the African, an adoption of a story from the Russian children's author and poet, Kornei Tchaikovsky. Produced by Mezoropom Film, or Workers International Relief, a German-Soviet film studio that made a number of films and animations between 1922 and 1936, including the first Soviet sound film, Road to Life, in 1931. Like many early animated productions, Senka is a mixed medium film that contains a blend of live action, side-by-side, with hand-drawn animation. This novel style of animation can be found among the earliest animated productions, like those created by Winsor McCay, Little Nemo, 1911, and Gertie the Dinosaur, 1914. Although unlike McCay's cartoons, the animation of Senka depicts the animated characters interacting with the live action world around them, rather than being depicted as simply drawings come to life by the artist's hand. The following year in 1928 would see another film aimed at children that also excelled in technical and dramatic storytelling, The Samoyed Boy, which tells the story of a young Samoyed, or Nenets boy, besting and killing a polar bear before going off to Leningrad and integrating into Soviet culture. Like the agitprop that lampoons the figure of the corrupt priest, the Samoyed Boy also depicts a wicked shaman that strands the boy on an ice cap at sea, only to be saved by a ship. Although propagandistic like the vast majority of early Soviet films, the Samoyed Boy does implement better dramatic narrative-driven story than some of its predecessors, unfortunately at the expense of belittling indigenous peoples' traditional culture. Anticipated by the Samoyed Boy, and also for its time technically and narratively impressive, Mstislav Paschenko's Zhabzha, which employed an experimental dye transfer to create color. Like its predecessor, both revolve around a tale of a youth, a bear, and a wicked witch. The piece stands as one of the most technically impressive feats of Soviet animation in the 1930s, and clearly displays influence from Western Disney-style animations, especially the anthropomorphized animal friends, while still maintaining a style and narrative that is chiefly Russian and evocative of Russian and Nenets folklore. A closing impressive animated film to come out at the end of the 1920s was The Adventures of the Little Chinese in 1928, which depicts two Chinese children traveling around the world. The movie walks in the footsteps of earlier Russian and Soviet productions. The stop-motion puppetry is evocative of the Russian works of Starovich, and the themes and propagandistic premise echo China in Flames, which was released 3 years prior. While the work could be called somewhat technically impressive for its time, it falls vastly short in terms of design and motion compared to the technically masterful works of Starovich, produced over a decade before. Starovich, especially after he left the USSR, began to perfect fluidity and motion in his stop-motion animations, and when compared side by side, the differences become apparent, if not somewhat jarring. The 1930s would see a variety of innovations and standardization within the Soviet animation industry, the introduction of cell animation, and the first Soviet colorized cartoons like Zhabzha. The decade saw far less artistic experimentation or innovative storytelling as witnessed throughout the 1920s, and many of the features from this period are child-friendly adaptations of Russian folklore and literature. With the close of the decade, the 1930s would see massive changes with the Soviet film and animation industry, as well as sweeping political changes following the death of V.I. Lenin in 1924 and the political battle for his successor, which ultimately became Joseph Stalin by October of 1927. These large political changes are reflected in Soviet art and film. The constructivism that thrived under Lenin-era USSR, along with its animated equivalents, would fall in favor of more streamlined Western Disney-style animations that tonally agreed with the state-approved socialist realism that dominated art under Stalin's leadership of the Communist Party. The two most important events for the future of Soviet animation occurred in the mid-1930s. The popularity and influence of Western animation, and, on June 10, 1936, the foundation of the Soviet juggernaut that would dominate the animation industry. Soyuz Multfilm. What started as a state-run and established animation studio to produce Western cell animation for children would pave the way for its animators and creators, and culminate in an artistic explosion that revolutionized and redefined what animation could be and was capable of. But before that shift could happen, there was the little matter of World War II. The wartime years were lean for the nation and the film industry as a whole. The child-centered adaptations of folklore were traded in propaganda pieces, not unlike animation of the 1920s. The trend of anti-fascist propaganda can be seen in East and West. American and Soviet animation studios alike were churning out content to support the war effort, and both American and Soviet studios would face increasingly larger budget cuts in the face of resource allocation for the war. September 8, 1941, began one of the worst sieges in military history, and with the fate of the 24-year-old nation uncertain, the animation industries that had been centered in Moscow found itself fleeing to Samarkand in Soviet Uzbekistan. Here they were extremely limited on time, money, resources, and staff. The staggering cost of war meant little money and resources could be allocated to animation, and the studios found themselves frequently understaffed as many of the animators had joined the Red Army to fight against the approaching threat of Nazi Germany in the Eastern Theater, what would be marked in Soviet history as the Great Patriotic War. Despite national turmoil and increasingly meager budgets, there are a number of impressive animations that come out of this period, consisting of wartime propaganda and the continued trend of animated adaptations of folklore. There was also a large move in hand-drawn animation, away from the traditional paper-drawn animations and onto the more streamlined cell animation technique, which allowed the creation of more 3D, lifelike animation, but also brought with it a Ford-style assembly line approach to how animation was produced. Cell animation, short for celluloid, is a process of applying ink to celluloid sheets and background, and photographing frame by frame to give the illusion of movement. This can best be explained by Uncle Walt himself in this 1957 demonstration.
Here, a Mickey Mouse short is being put on film. Mickey has been inked and painted on transparent sheets of celluloid. This happens to be a panorama effect where the character will walk in one place and the background keeps moving behind him to create the illusion. Each time a new cell of Mickey is photographed, the background must be moved a fraction of an inch. Photographing each one of these celluloids of Mickey and background makes a single frame of motion picture film.
The streamlined assembly line approach can also be demonstrated in another exhibition produced by Fleischer Studios.
You have no doubt observed how the action creates the illusion of motion. From the in-betweeners, the pencil drawings pass on to the cartoon inkers. The inkers trace the sketches on squares of celluloid. For short, they are called cells. They provide the characters with an invisible support and facilitate their arrangement with other figures as well as backgrounds. The ink drawings are then filled in with color. At the stockroom counter, painters or fillers in replenish their ever-dwindling color supplies.
By 1943, Soyuz Multfilm would return to Moscow, and in 1946, at the end of World War II, the animation industry would recover, and the post-war years brought animation with more color, increased stylization, and bigger budgets. With a larger Soviet Union encompassing East Germany to the eastern edge of Asia, the Soviet film industry was made larger, and a variety of new voices would contribute to a more diverse and dissenting crowd of talented artists and animators. Especially out of Prague and Czechoslovakia, where the Czech culture's rich history of puppetry would lead to some of the most powerful animated films to ever be produced. The shining star of these films was Jiří Trinka, whose 3-decade career reinvigorated the traditional Czech art of puppetry. His works and influence paved the way for a generation of talented Czech artists that would take the animation world by storm in the decades after the war. This post-war period was the golden age of Soviet cel animation, and paved the way for the experimentation, the rebirth of puppetry and stop motion that would come to revolutionize Soviet animation following 1960 and the post-Stalinist thaw. With Stalin's death in March of 1953, his office would ultimately pass to Nikita Khrushchev, who would slowly enact political changes away from the Stalinist system and relax the strict censorship laws that were characteristic of Stalin's party leadership. These changes, known historically as the Khrushchev thaw, had an enormous impact on the art and film industry of the USSR, and in conjunction with increasingly skilled and talented artists, the 1960s would usher in a new golden age of Soviet animation and push the boundaries and redefine what animation was truly capable of, inspiring generations of filmmakers and artists down to the present day. The dawning of a new era had arrived. Although censorship was far from eliminated, Khrushchev's thaw helped to birth a new subgenre of animation within the USSR, the animation of political dissidents. Drawing from the well of inspiration of old Soviet agitprop pieces, these animations dared to do what could not be done under the less politically tolerant tenure of Stalin's reign. One of the first and most notable would come in 1965, Ruka, or The Hand, made by the shining star of Prague, Jiří Trinka, who would self-proclaim the film his masterpiece. The short depicts a lone artist living in a cottage, wanting to be left alone to make his flower pots. The titular hand of the film manages to work his propagandizing will to the artist through the telephone and television set. The hand's message is bold and not particularly subtle, and the hand enslaves the artist, culminating in the character's final rebellion before meeting his demise and being venerated and laid to rest by the same authoritarian hand that brought about his demise. Trinka's work, The Hand in particular, has cultivated influence to the present day, and Trinka inspired and paved the way for a host of young talent in Prague that would embrace the puppetry and surrealism native to the Golden City, the most talented and notable of these being Jan Švankmajer, Prague native whose massive body of work and influences continues into the present day with his most recent work, Insects, a feature-length film released in 2018. Švankmajer's work is an amalgam of different styles and mediums, from sculpting and animation to feature-length live-action films. He is best known for his surrealist contributions to stop motion and the incredibly detailed and fluid sculptures and motions that help breathe life into his short films. Works like his masterpiece, Dimensions of Dialogue, display the careful detail that Švankmajer put forth in his animation, as well as his careful choice of texture to set the tone of a piece and inspire feelings in the viewer that range from comedic relief to grotesque uneasiness. Trinka also served as an inspiration to Czech animator Jiří Bárta. Outside of the USSR, the famed Japanese master of stop motion, Kiichiro Kawamoto, who traveled from Japan to personally study under Trinka. Kawamoto's work spans 4 decades, and the influence of Czech puppetry can be clearly seen in his productions, such as 1972's The Demon, or Oni, which combines the Czech puppet artistry with traditional Japanese puppetry and aesthetics. Outside of Czechoslovakia and in the Russian heart of the USSR, a wave of new styles and themes swept through the animation world through the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. Fyodor Kittrik's 1966 animation, Man in the Frame, clearly shows an inspiration from the 20s agitprop, as well as early Soviet constructivism. The animation exhibits a variety of styles and is much more reflective of contemporary Soviet culture than the adaptations of folklore and fairy tales that dominated Soviet animation of the 1930s to the 50s. These more adult themes and experimentation with design and geometry can be glimpsed in Kittrik's first film, The Story of a Crime, in 1962, which is a satire piece of the chaos of modern urban life, and unlike the animation of the 50s, display more adult themes and greater level of artistic experimentation. The animation style of The Story of a Crime is reminiscent of the experimental American animations being produced at the time by UPA, United Productions of America. Especially in regard to its experimental lines and innovative use of geometry, even having characters fade into nothing more than a series of lines when entering a dark room. Andrei Krzyzanowski's 1966 work, There Lived Kozyavan, served as a satirical criticism of the modern office bureaucracy in the USSR, a theme that would be just at home on Madison Avenue as it was in Moscow. The feature greatly experiments with animation style and sound, a fixture that would become a staple of Krzyzanowski's later animated works, reaching new heights in his surreal masterpiece, The Glass Harmonica, in 1968. The film serves as a testament to the destructive forces of capital and censorship upon the artist and draws heavy stylistic inspiration from the Renaissance and surreal art, including the otherworldly paintings of Hieronymus Bosch and Francisco Goya. The movie was heavily censored in its time, and many did not get a chance to see it until nearly 2 decades after its creation. Numerous changes were made to the production throughout its creation, but ultimately its themes and styles, which were originally intended to be more critical of the Soviet state than capital, still proved too subversive even after the thaw. Glass Harmonica stands as a masterwork of Soviet animation, and was unfortunately robbed of its potential influence on Soviet animation following the film's completion due to its being shelved. Outside of the growing number of animations that were targeted for adults, popular animation for children was still alive and well into the 1970s, with Gina the Crocodile and perhaps the most recognizable animated icon from the USSR, Cheburashka. Cheburashka was an immensely popular character in Soviet children's programming. He is an amalgamation of different characteristics from small mammals: large mouse-like ears, a short stature, a shape comparable to a bear or monkey. The character became so popular among children in the USSR that he rose to prominence and became the symbolic mascot of Soyuz Multfilm, not unlike the role Mickey Mouse came to assume within the Disney company. No history of Soviet animation could ever be complete without talking about, perhaps, the greatest Soviet Russian animator, Yuri Norstein, who completed not one, but 2 productions that have long fought for the title of greatest animated film. Like the Soviet cartoons of the war era, Norstein's first masterpiece is an adaptation of a Russian folktale, Hedgehog in the Fog, from 1975. The short still stands today as one of the most recognizable pieces of Soviet animation ever produced. The story is rather straightforward. A hedgehog, on his way to see his friend, Bear, gets distracted by a white horse in the fog. The hedgehog gets lost in the fog, all the while avoiding an owl that is after him. The hedgehog manages to escape with the help of a fish, and is finally able to unite with his friend and look at the stars. Norstein's animation style brings the movie to life as if it were a moving storybook. The fog and the set design create a film of great atmosphere that is nearly unrivaled in any other animated work. Norstein's subsequent work in 1979, Tale of Tales, takes a much different approach to the storytelling than its predecessor. Tale of Tales is a surreal and beautiful exploration of the stream of consciousness following a little gray wolf, The film plays out a series of vignettes loosely associated with one another, exploring themes like loneliness, war, and death. The title and work itself was inspired by a poem of the same name by Nazim Hikmet. We stand above the water, sun, cat, plane tree, me, and our destiny. The water is cool, the plane tree is tall, the sun is shining, the cat is dozing. I write verses. Thank God we live. Perhaps the greatest and last animated masterpiece before the fall of the Soviet Union, The Tale of Tales pushes all boundaries of what animation can look like and the stories that it can tell. Norstein's influence can still be felt throughout the animation world, and his work has even influenced one of the most well-known animators in the present day, Studio Ghibli's Hayao Miyazaki. There are notable animators that come after Norstein also. Igor Kovalyov, whose most famous Soviet production is Hin, His Wife, went on to lead a successful career in the United States after the fall of the USSR, working on American animations from The Simpsons to Real Monsters, and even Rugrats. Soviet animation reached an impressive zenith in the mid-20th century, and through the works of talented artists and animators, Soviet animation helped to reshape and redefine animation for future generations. And even after the collapse of the USSR in 1992, Soyuz Multfilm still survives in modern-day Russia and still produces animated content, even though the golden age is long over. Soviet animation left its artistic mark on the industry and can still amaze and confound audiences to this day in the digital age.